Why did the laughter sting more than the heat? That was the question Mara Ellison asked herself as the California sun hammered down on the grinder, the training slab where reputations were forged or broken. The asphalt shimmered like metal under fire, each step radiating the kind of heat that cooked patience and pride alike. Around her, boat crews circled like restless wolves, laughter sharp and uncertain. The kind that looked for weakness, the kind that fed on difference. She stood still, her shadow cutting through the glare, unmoving. Oversized gray PT shorts hung loose around her legs. A plain navy t-shirt clung to her shoulders, soaked with salt and grit. Nothing about her demanded attention, no insignia, no medals, no swagger, just stillness. That alone seemed to irritate them. "Commissaries that way, ma'am," Master Chief Navarro called out, arms folded like a barricade. His grin carried the weight of habit, the kind of authority that rarely got questioned. "These aren't yoga mats. Try the right gear before you get hurt." Laughter broke out across the deck, brittle, forced. A shared ritual of mockery disguised as humor, young men aligning themselves with power. She didn't move. Her boots pressed against the steaming asphalt. Her gaze met no one's and yet seemed to see through all of them. She blinked against the sting of salt and dust, neither flinching nor fighting. The silence that followed her stillness was uncomfortable, the kind that revealed more about the crowd than the target. From the catwalk above, Captain Hale leaned forward. There was something about the woman's composure that unsettled him, a memory stirred of dust, noise, and a woman's voice on a radio years ago. He couldn't place it yet, but he watched. When the whistle blew, Mara turned toward Supply, her movements calm and deliberate. The laughter followed for a few seconds, then died off, fading like a storm that realized it had lost direction. The next morning came with the same merciless sun. The grinder roared again, boat crews dragging IBS rafts across the deck, instructors shouting, the metallic tang of gun oil and salt air filling the lungs. The noise was constant, chaotic, alive. Mara sat quietly near the rail racks, peeling back a strip of kinesiology tape from her forearm. Beneath it ran a thin scar, pale against sun-browned skin. She moved with precision, the kind of precision born not from vanity, but from knowing what nerve damage could do if ignored. A young candidate hovered near her. His eyes caught the mark before he could hide it. "Old injury?" he asked, awkward but curious. "Old reminder," she said simply. Her voice was steady, controlled. "Even tape has to know who's in charge." He didn't know how to respond, so he nodded and walked away differently, slower, thoughtful. Respect wasn't demanded. It was earned in silence. By mid-morning, the candidates moved to the pool. Sunlight shattered across the water like glass. Instructors stacked fins and rebreathers, the smell of chlorine thick in the air. Mara's senses stayed alert, tuned to the smallest sounds, a hiss, a click, a breath drawn wrong. Somewhere behind her, a whisper drifted through the ranks. "Policy fix," someone said. "They're making room for optics." The rumor died when she walked past. Her presence silenced what her rank couldn't. Later at the obstacle course, the heat pressed like armor. Mara moved along the rails, her eyes tracing every movement, spotting small slips, a lazy grip, a misplaced hand. She saw mistakes before they happened. When one candidate nearly fell from the beam, she exhaled sharply, not panic, but relief, the kind that came from seeing survival snatch victory by inches. That's when the Iraqi liaison approached with a translator. The man's uniform bore desert dust and quiet dignity. Mara slowed, matching his pace, and spoke before the translator could open his mouth, fluent Arabic, smooth, precise, personal. The liaison's eyes widened. Surprise softened into understanding. The translator stepped back, realizing he wasn't needed. Around them, the others stared, confused, curious, perhaps a little uneasy. How did she know their language so well? Mystery, she knew, was armor. From above, Captain Hale felt the click of recognition again. The way she carried herself, the faint scar on her forearm, the way she listened before speaking, it all echoed something buried deep in his memory. A coin, a name, a rumor about a mission that wasn't supposed to exist. By late afternoon, the mood on the grinder had changed. The laughter had faded, replaced by something harder to name, discipline, perhaps, respect growing where noise had once lived. The pool deck buzzed with tension. Candidates stood lined along the water's edge, masks dangling, air thick with chlorine and nerves. This was the remedial dive. On paper, it was simple. In reality, it had broken men stronger than any of them wanted to admit. Navarro's voice barked over the noise. "Alvarez, you're up." The young man's hands trembled as he adjusted his mask. His breath came fast. "Yes, Master Chief." He dropped into the pool. Bubbles rose, scattering across the surface. Then came the telltale signs of panic, fumbling rope, broken rhythm, the sudden frantic movements of a man losing control. The nearest safety diver was tangled in another lane. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Mara didn't think. She didn't wait for orders. She stripped her shirt in one smooth motion, tied her hair and signaled downward, one palm slicing the air. "I'm going." Permission or not. She dove clean, no splash, no hesitation. The water swallowed her whole. In seconds, she was beside Alvarez, her arms locking around him in a practiced rescue hold. Legs kicked hard, driving both toward the surface. 2 sharp breaths, then the signal on deck. She rolled him gently, checked his pulse, inspected the mask. A fine tear glinted near the seal. She pulled a spare from her kit and pressed it into his shaking hands. "This one seals. Yours doesn't," she said evenly. "Bad seal traps go 2 panic follows. Always check before you dive." Alvarez nodded, speechless. Around them, the silence was almost holy. The same men who'd mocked her now couldn't find words. Navarro's jaw clenched, his pride caught in his throat. Moments later, one of the instructors wheeled out a rebreather for demonstration. He locked the hoses, but a faint hiss slipped through the noise. Mara lifted a finger. "Check your O-ring," she said. He did. The seal wasn't seated. One twist, hiss gone. He looked up, startled. She'd already turned away. From the bleachers, Alvarez whispered to Parker, "That wasn't luck." Parker swallowed. No, that was something else. By the time Mara pulled her shirt back on, the dynamic had shifted. She didn't need applause. Her calm was louder than their noise. Later that afternoon, storm clouds rolled in, dulling the sky to steel. The base seemed to hold its breath. Captain Hale descended from the catwalk, boots crunching against grit. "Walk with me," he said. She joined him along the fence line, the wind pushing dust around their boots. Her coin turned between her fingers, a small, worn piece of metal engraved with an anchor and wings. He caught the glint and froze. He knew that coin. "Pash Paratos," she murmured, "in peace prepared." The words hit him like a memory reborn. He'd seen that same coin once, on a memorial table after an operation few dared to mention. Only 5 had ever been minted. His eyes fell to the scar along her forearm, to the controlled way she pressed her thumb to the tendon. A moment crystallized: the convoy ambush, the buried charge, the EOD officer who'd crawled under fire to disarm it with a ceramic blade. "You were the one at Route Sion," he said quietly. She didn't look at him. "We all just did our jobs." Before he could reply, Navarro approached with his candidates in tow. The storm growled across the bay. "Captain," Navarro barked, but Hale's tone cut through the wind, sharp, decisive. "Master Chief," he said, "you owe Lieutenant Commander Ellison an apology." The words struck like gunfire. Every candidate froze. Even the gulls seemed to pause mid-flight. Navarro's face tightened. Pride warred with realization. For once he had no retort. Mara stepped back, giving him room. "We all went home that night because people did their jobs," she said softly. "That's all." Her humility left no room for argument. Thunder rolled over the water. "Candidates," Navarro finally barked, his voice lower now, rougher. "Retrieve Lieutenant Commander Ellison's gear." Boots hit the deck in unison. Minutes later they returned, arms full of her folded uniform, notebook, and toiletries. Each man placed them neatly at her feet, heads bowed, eyes low. Mara bent, gathered her things, and whispered, "Thank you." No anger, no pride, just quiet reclamation. Captain Hale cleared his throat. "Lieutenant Commander, run a safety demo with Instructor Lyrie. Full kit." A murmur ran through the ranks. "Full combat gear here." She nodded, no hesitation. Plate carrier, helmet, comm rig, rifle. Movements deliberate, smooth, no wasted motion. "This isn't about looking tough," she said. "It's about preventing injuries before they happen." She tapped her sling. "Tape it here, otherwise it snags ladders and snaps wrists." She held up chem lights. "Bundle and tape these before night surf. Loose gear becomes debris, and debris costs you calm." Every candidate leaned forward. "Ma'am," Alvarez asked, "heat casualties after log PT, prep advice." "Prohydrate with sodium," she replied instantly. "Engage scapular pulls before shoulder load. Skip it, and you'll make it through the set but pay in surgery later." No lecture, no theatrics, just experience speaking through scar tissue. Navarro stepped forward. His boots scraped against the deck. His face was hard, but his voice changed. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I was wrong." He raised his hand in salute. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then one by one, every candidate followed. The grinder fell silent. Where ridicule once lived, respect took root. The storm above broke open, thunder rolling across the bay, but no one moved. Because they all knew, deep down, they just witnessed the real thing. And from that day forward, the sound of the grinder was never the same. What happens when respect replaces noise? For Mara Ellison, silence was never just quiet, it was consequence. The kind that follows a shift too big to name. The grinder, once filled with the sound of mockery, now pulsed with something heavier, sharper. When she walked across it the next morning, heads didn't turn out of curiosity anymore, they turned out of acknowledgement. No one spoke. Not the instructors, not the candidates. Even the gulls seemed to circle wider, as if the air itself remembered the lesson. The early light hit her face as she tightened her boots. The salt had stiffened the leather, leaving faint white scars, the kind you didn't polish away. She pulled her sleeves down, fingers brushing against the kinesiology tape that hid the old nerve damage. The scar had its own memory, a buried blast, a noise that still rang faintly in her bones. Across the deck, Navarro adjusted his cap. He looked smaller now, though no one dared to say it. He caught her eye for half a second and nodded. Not an apology this time, a salute disguised as one. She nodded back once, nothing more needed. The morning drill began with the same violence of routine: ropes, surf, commands shouted over waves. But something had changed. Orders carried purpose now. Corrections were sharp, not cruel. There was a difference between breaking and building, and they'd all seen the cost of confusing the two. Mara moved between teams, her voice calm and precise. "Check your straps. Breathe through the pause. Noise wastes air, focus doesn't." No rank in her tone, only respect. It carried further than any yell could. Later in the gear bay, she found Parker and Alvarez double-checking mask straps, talking in low voices. Parker saw her first, straightened reflexively. "Ma'am," he said, awkward, "we were just—" "I know," she interrupted softly, setting her gloves down. "You're doing what professionals do, checking before assuming." Alvarez smiled faintly. "We didn't used to." Mara looked up. "Now you do, that's what matters." Her words weren't meant as praise, but they landed that way. Because in this place, acknowledgement meant everything. Still, beneath that calm surface, a different current ran, quiet, unseen. Because while the crew learned respect, Mara carried something they didn't: the memory of Route Sion, the convoy, the explosion that almost rewired her life. Sometimes, in the middle of drills, the memory returned uninvited: heat, static, metal bending like it was made of breath. The sound that followed wasn't thunder or explosion. It was the silence that came after, the kind where even your heartbeat feels intrusive. She'd seen faces then, two men shouting but unheard, light flickering through dust. And in the middle of it, she'd crawled forward with one tool and one thought: if she failed, everyone behind her vanished. There was no audience then. No cameras, no laughter, just purpose. Now, standing on this sun-baked slab of concrete, she wondered if silence always followed courage, or if it simply waited for it. The sound of boots approached behind her. Captain Hale. His presence was quieter than most, but not invisible. "Morning, Lieutenant Commander," he said, voice even. "Morning, sir." He leaned against the frame of the doorway, arms crossed, gaze following the recruits dragging boats across the sand. "They're not laughing anymore." "No," she replied, "they're learning." He studied her for a long moment. "You could have embarrassed Navarro in front of his own men. You didn't." "Wouldn't change what needed fixing," she said. "Humility does more than revenge ever will." Hale smiled faintly. "I'd forgotten that." The two stood in silence for a while, not awkward, but steady. Shared understanding between soldiers who'd both seen too much. Finally, Hale broke it. "I looked up the record," he said. "Route Sion, you weren't listed." Myra didn't turn. "Wasn't supposed to be." "You saved 5 men," he said quietly. "I did my job," she answered. Then softer: "Not all of them made it." Her voice faltered, the way people's voices do when truth and guilt mix in the same breath. Hale nodded. "That kind of loss doesn't vanish." "No," she said, "but it teaches you what noise is worth ignoring." Outside, thunder echoed faintly, the last of last night's storm rolling out to sea. The day stretched on: sweat, commands, salt, routine. Yet beneath it all, an unspoken shift continued, something like respect maturing into reverence. By midday, the candidates stood at parade rest, waiting for orders. Navarro called them to attention, but this time his voice lacked edge. "We're moving into rescue drills. Pair up. Ellison, oversight." She nodded, stepping forward. The crew parted like water. "Remember," she said, scanning each face, "you don't save people by showing off. You save them by staying calm when it matters most." A few nodded. Some avoided eye contact, uncomfortable with how much truth sat in her tone. "Confidence," she continued, "isn't loud. It's quiet and earned. If you're screaming, you're not thinking." It wasn't a quote from a manual. It was something lived, shaped by years of hearing men panic over open mics in combat zones. They began. Pairs dove surfaced, repeated, some strong, some shaky. Alvarez nearly slipped on his descent, but this time he steadied himself, slow breath, measured movement. When he surfaced, she gave a small nod. He returned it like it meant more than any medal. Later, during chow, Parker sat beside her on the edge of the pier. The water below shimmered dull silver, the sun breaking through clouds in fractured beams. "Ma'am," he said, hesitant, "can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why do you stay quiet all the time? I mean, even when people don't deserve your patience." She stared out at the horizon, where sea met sky in a faint blur. "Because noise doesn't make you right, it just makes you louder. When you've seen what happens after shouting stops, quiet feels like power." Parker nodded, though he didn't fully understand. Not yet. Behind them, laughter broke out from another group, not mocking this time, but real light. It rolled across the water harmlessly. For a second, Mara smiled. Small, private, gone just as fast. That night, when the base lights dimmed and the grinder fell silent, she stayed behind. Alone. The sky stretched black, stars scattered like shrapnel frozen midair. The air carried salt and oil, old and familiar. She sat on the same steps where Alvarez had once thanked her, now empty, the sound of waves against the pier the only rhythm left. She pulled out the coin again, turned it over between her fingers. The engraving caught faint light. 5 coins minted, 1 per operator. She'd carried hers for 9 years, the others gone. She rubbed her thumb along the edge, feeling every scratch, every dent. A small, perfect weight. In the dark, she whispered to no one. They didn't laugh that day either. It wasn't bitterness, it was remembrance. A soft wind brushed against her cheek, salt, night, the smell of machines cooling after heat. Somewhere far off, she heard the dull thud of waves against steel hulls. She thought of how strength wasn't built in shouting or proving anyone wrong. It was built in small decisions, tiny, invisible acts of resilience. The next morning, inspection came. A new group of officers from HQ arrived, clipboard types, pressed uniforms, curiosity without context. They saw the candidates lined neatly, gear perfect, tone disciplined. And they saw her standing off to the side, silent, observing. One of them leaned toward Hale. "That's the woman from the memo, the one you recommended for safety protocol revision." Hale nodded slowly. "That's her." The man jotted something on his pad. "She runs a tight ship." "She doesn't run it," Hale said quietly. "She steadies it." Later, Mara watched as the inspectors walked away, satisfied with order they didn't understand. She said nothing. Because leadership, she'd learned, wasn't about being seen. It was about being steady when others watched you break. By evening, the crews returned from the surf, gear soaked and heavy. The sun burned red over the horizon, waves catching firelight reflections. Mara walked along the shoreline, boots sinking slightly into wet sand. A gull cried overhead. The ocean hissed and breathed. She stopped, letting the cold water wash over her toes, soaking through the boots she hadn't taken off. The noise of the bass faded behind her. In that moment, she felt something rare, peace not born of victory but acceptance. Because strength, she realized, wasn't about never falling. It was about returning again and again to the place where others stopped. As she turned back toward the grinder, the first stars began to emerge, each one distant, quiet but unflinching. And though no one saw her smile, the night did. The grinder, once an echo of mockery, now held its own kind of silence, a silence earned. And for Mara Ellison, that was enough. What happens when peace feels temporary? For Mara Ellison, quiet never lasted long. Not here, not in a place where calm usually meant something was about to break. The grinder had gone still that morning, no shouting, no laughter, only the steady rhythm of boots striking the deck in unison. The recruits moved like a single body now, each motion efficient, silent. The air carried discipline. But beneath it, Mara felt something else building, that familiar pressure before orders changed everything. She'd been in enough units to recognize the signs. Command visits, shifts in tone, conversations that stopped when doors opened. She laced her boots tighter and tied the last knot with the same focus she once used to arm explosives. Hands steady, mind clear, face unreadable. Captain Hale's shadow appeared on the edge of the platform. "Ellison," he called. His voice was firm but not unfriendly. She turned, "Sir." He nodded toward the small admin building near the fence. "Command review in 10. They requested your presence." Mara blinked once, then looked toward the group of visiting officers she'd noticed the day before, polished boots, hard eyes, clipboards clutched like shields. She knew the type. They came to observe, which often meant judge. Hale caught her glance. "Don't overthink it," he said quietly. She half smiled. "Overthinking's my brand, sir." He almost laughed but stopped himself. "They're from higher up. They read the incident reports, the dive, the discipline shift. They're curious." Curious, that word again. The polite face of suspicion. When she entered the briefing room, the air felt colder than outside. The ceiling fan hummed with mechanical indifference. 3 officers sat at the table: Commander Rhodes, lean and sharp; Lieutenant Benton, eyes full of restless calculation, and a civilian liaison whose expression didn't match his rank badge. They didn't rise when she entered. Rhodes gestured to a chair. "Lieutenant Commander Ellison, sit." She did back straight, hands folded, calm. Benton spoke first. "You've caused quite a shift here." "Unintentional," she replied. "That's the best kind," Rhodes said, flipping through papers. "The reports mention an unauthorized dive rescue." "Correct," she said. "Protocol breach," Benton added, "yet it prevented a fatality." "Also correct." The civilian leaned forward. "Why act without permission?" Mara looked at him. Because permission would have taken 6 seconds, he had 4. The room went quiet. Even the fan seemed to slow. Rhodes nodded faintly, understood. Benton tapped his pen. "You also demonstrated equipment safety before command authorization." She met his eyes. "If you need authorization to prevent an accident, you're already too late." The civilian smiled slightly, not with humor but with interest. "You think like an operator, not a trainer." "I was both once," she said. Rhodes studied her, eyes narrowing. "Root Scion." The words hit like an echo. She didn't respond, but her fingers tightened slightly against her thigh. "I was there," Rhodes said quietly. "Different convoy. We heard the blast on comms." He paused. "We heard what you did." Silence held the room again, not awkward but reverent. Rhodes closed the folder. "Ellison, there's a field evaluation exercise in 2 weeks. Joint ops training with NATO observers. I want you on oversight." Benton frowned. "Sir, she's non-combat status." "She's qualified," Rhodes cut in, "and frankly, I want her there." Mara said nothing, though something inside her stirred. Field. Real terrain. Real risks. It had been years since she'd stood anywhere that wasn't sanitized by protocol. "Understood," she said finally. Rhodes nodded, dismissed. Outside, the sunlight felt heavier. The base moved as it always did, structured chaos, but she felt the hum beneath it change. Orders like that carried through whispers faster than radio static. By afternoon, Parker caught up to her near the armory. "Ma'am, rumor says you're going out again." "Rumors talk too much," she said, setting a crate of dive fins on the rack. He hesitated. "You're actually going, though?" She looked at him, gauging his concern. "If the field still trusts me, I won't argue." He nodded slowly. "We'll miss your eyes on the deck." She almost smiled. "The deck doesn't need eyes, it needs discipline." Still, when she walked away, she felt the weight of his words settle somewhere deep. That evening she sat by the shoreline again, the place she'd started calling her peace line. Waves licked the pier in slow rhythm. The horizon burned gold, fading into steel-blue dusk. She pulled the coin from her pocket, thumb running along its edge. "In peace prepared." She whispered the motto under her breath, the same way she'd whispered prayers in places too loud for words. The next few days blurred. Preparations, briefings, loadouts, the smell of oil and canvas and sea. Mara trained alongside younger instructors, adjusting techniques, checking redundancies. Every motion was habit layered over instinct. On the morning of deployment, the air felt thick, not from weather but expectation. The Joint Ops exercise would simulate downed pilot recovery in rough coastal terrain. Real water, real stress, controlled danger but danger nonetheless. Captain Hale met her by the dock. "You ready?" "As much as I ever am," she said, securing her gear. "Rhodes wanted me to tell you, nay, O liaison will observe the first phase. Keep it clean." She smirked faintly. "I'll try not to drown anyone important." Hale chuckled, brief but genuine. "That's all I ask." They launched mid-morning. The inflatable boat cut through chop and glare. The coastline stretched ahead, jagged and unfamiliar. Wind whipped against her face, bringing the sharp taste of salt and adrenaline. Half the candidates she trained were now in that boat, Parker among them, jaw tight, eyes forward. She watched them in silence. Each one had changed since her arrival, less arrogance, more control. And as the boat approached the target zone, she felt an old sensation return, not fear, not quite excitement, just awareness. That sharpened state of being alive where every sense tuned perfectly. The exercise began. Teams moved ashore, fanning out through rock and scrub. Communications crackled, clipped, and precise. The objective: locate, stabilize, and extract a downed pilot before simulated enemy units reached them. Mara monitored from the perimeter, headset on, watching. Parker's team advanced quickly, maintaining formation, clean transitions until static cut across comms. Team 2, repeat, she said, adjusting frequency. Nothing. Then a voice panicked, half garbled. We've lost contact, riverbed signal interference. Her gut tightened. She recognized the tone. It wasn't scripted panic. She sprinted toward the ridge, ignoring calls to hold position. The ground sloped hard, loose gravel under boots. When she reached the crest, she saw it, one of the candidates half submerged near the embankment, tangled in a net of roots and debris. Current stronger than expected. Training exercise or not, water didn't care. Without hesitation, she dropped her gear and descended. The rocks tore skin from her palms, but she didn't feel it. Hold still, she shouted. The current roared, swallowing her voice. The candidate's head slipped under. Mara Dove. Cold shock hit her lungs like electricity. Her hands found him, fingers gripping his vest. She cut the strap with her dive knife and pulled. Her muscles screamed from the strain, but she kept pulling, dragging him toward shallower water. When they surfaced near the bank, he coughed, gasped, alive. She rolled him on his side, pressing his chest to clear water. Breathe, she commanded. He did. She sat back, chest heaving. Around them, the others arrived, eyes wide. Captain Hale's voice came over the comm. Ellison, report. Minor incident, she said between breaths. Candidate recovered. Continuing assessment. Silence on the line, then copy. When they returned to the base that evening, no one spoke much. The recruits moved slower, quieter, their adrenaline replaced by reflection. Later, Parker approached her near the storage cages. You saved him. She shook her head. He saved himself. I just reminded him to breathe. But you went in again, Parker said. You didn't have to. She looked at him, eyes steady. No one ever has to. That's what makes it count. That night, Mara sat outside her quarters, watching the lights flicker across the bay. The reflection shimmered on the water, breaking and reforming with every wave. She thought about the boy's face underwater, that instant between panic and surrender, and about all the faces before his. Strength, she realized, wasn't something people saw in you. It was what they remembered when you weren't there. When Captain Hale found her there, he didn't speak for a while. Then he said quietly, "Command," calling it an exemplary exercise. She nodded. Exemplary doesn't mean perfect. He smiled. You always say that. Because it's true. He hesitated, then asked, do you ever think about going back, field ops, full status? Her gaze stayed on the horizon. Every day, she admitted, but some doors stay closed for good reasons. Hale nodded slowly. Still, for what it's worth, if I ever had to pick someone to stand between my team and chaos again, I'd pick you. She turned to him, surprised. Why? He shrugged. Because you don't fight for control, you anchor it. The compliment hit harder than any medal. After he left, Mara stayed a while longer, listening to the low hum of the bay. The wind carried a whisper of the ocean's endless rhythm, something steady, infinite, forgiving. And in that sound, she heard a truth she'd lived her whole life. Real strength doesn't roar. It doesn't demand attention. It shows up. It acts. It endures. And sometimes it dives in again. Why do they always want to know what broke you? That was the thought that followed Mara Ellison as she walked through the command hallway 2 mornings later. The walls were sterile white, lined with framed commendations, metal smiles on paper. She learned long ago that metals and memories rarely agreed on what mattered. Outside, the grinder echoed faintly with morning drills, the rhythm of discipline. The place had changed since her arrival, sharper now, calmer, but today there was tension in the air again, something unspoken, humming under every command. Captain Hale waited for her near the operations board. His expression told her enough. There was news. "They're sending NATO observers," he said. Myra raised a brow. "For what?" "The exercise you ran," he replied. "The incident made waves. Word got up the chain, they want to see your methods firsthand." "Observers," she repeated flatly. He nodded. "Command, calling it an evaluation. I call it a test." Mara exhaled through her nose. "And I'm the subject." "Not officially," Hale said, though the corner of his mouth hinted otherwise. "Rhodes is on your side, but others aren't convinced." She adjusted her sleeves, hiding the faint tremor in her hand, an old injury, or maybe nerves she'd never admit. "They're looking for confirmation bias," she said. "Either I'm proof of progress or proof of mistake." "Pretty much," Hale admitted. "One observer's former EOD, British unit, callsign Fletcher, says he remembers your name from the Cyan files." That made her still. Root Cyan again, the ghost that refused to stay buried. She met his eyes, "And if he remembers too much?" "Then you tell the truth," Hale said softly. Mara almost smiled. "The truth doesn't play well in rooms like that." "Maybe not," Hale said, "but it still outlasts them." He handed her a sealed folder. "Briefing packet, they'll arrive by noon." She took it, nodded once and walked away. By midday, the sky had turned pale and hard. The bay shimmered like glass. NATO insignias decorated 2 utility vehicles parked near the pier, their presence as subtle as a flare. Mara met them on the platform, 3 of them, all in crisp uniforms. 1 woman, 2 men. The woman introduced herself first, accent clipped and British. "Commander Leela Fletcher, Royal Navy EOD Liaison. These are Major Decker and Colonel Sorensen." Mara offered a firm handshake. "Lieutenant Commander Ellison." Fletcher's grip was strong, not a test, just acknowledgement. "We've read your file," she said, "or what's left of it." "That makes 2 of us," Mara replied. Fletcher smirked faintly. "We're here to observe, not to interfere. But between you and me, they're watching to see if the silence around your past has value or danger." Mara met her eyes. "Silence keeps some people alive." "Or keeps others wondering," Fletcher said. It wasn't accusation, more like curiosity sharpened by experience. They walked together along the grinder as the recruits trained. The air smelled of salt, sweat, and steel. The sound of ropes slapping deck echoed in rhythm. Fletcher watched as Mara corrected a candidate's form with 2 fingers and a single word. No shouting, no theatrics, just precision. "She doesn't bark," Sorensen murmured. "They listen anyway." "Because she doesn't waste their attention," Fletcher said. Later, in the observation hut overlooking the dive pool, the NATO trio watched the candidates run through underwater navigation drills. Fletcher leaned forward. "Notice the breathing control," she said to the others. "Her cadence matches theirs. She regulates tempo through tone, not command." "Efficient," Decker noted. "Unorthodox." "Effective," Fletcher corrected. Mara said little during the session. Her hands stayed clasped behind her back, her eyes scanning every motion, each flicker of hesitation, each sign of panic before it bloomed. When one diver surfaced too fast, gasping, she didn't scold. She knelt, level with him. "What did you feel before you came up?" she asked. He hesitated. "Pressure, then I panicked." She nodded. "Next time, listen to that pressure. It's your signal to slow down, not escape. You can't fight water, you can only move with it." The recruit nodded, understanding dawning. Fletcher's expression softened. "She's not training them to pass, she's training them to survive." Sorensen leaned back. Reminds me of our old mountain instructors. Didn't care about rank, just about readiness. When the session ended, Fletcher followed Mara outside. The afternoon light glared off the steel railings, turning the air almost white. "Cyan," Fletcher said quietly. Mara stopped walking. "What about it?" "I was on the clearance team 2 sectors north," Fletcher said. "We heard the comms cut out, heard the blast." Mara said nothing. "They told us everyone in your convoy died," Fletcher continued. "Later, someone said a woman crawled through a live kill zone with a ceramic blade." Mara's voice was even. "Stories grow better with distance." "I don't care about legend," Fletcher said. "I care about truth, what really happened." Mara's eyes shifted to the horizon, the line where sea met sky, always changing, never constant. "What happened was simple. We were ambushed. Improvised device under the lead truck. Firing chain exposed. I cut it." "You should have waited for clearance," Fletcher said automatically. "I didn't have clearance," Mara replied. "I had seconds." Fletcher's jaw tensed. "And the rest of your team?" Mara's silence answered. "The wind carried it away, soft as breath." After a long pause, Fletcher said quietly, "They gave you a medal, didn't they?" "It never reached me," Mara said. "Why?" "Because I didn't want it." Fletcher studied her, really studied her. Then she nodded once, almost respectfully. "That's why they don't understand you." "They don't have to," Mara said, turning back toward the base. "They just have to learn." That evening, the observers were invited to the training debrief. The recruits lined up under the setting sun, uniforms damp, faces sunburned but alert. Captain Hale opened with the day's summary, then gestured toward Mara. "Lieutenant Commander Ellison will close us out," he said. She stepped forward, hands clasped behind her back. "When I first came here," she began, her voice carrying easily through the salt air, "the sound on this deck was different. Laughter, mockery, noise. Now it's focus. Not because anyone demanded it, but because you learned what noise costs." The recruits listened, motionless. "Every time you check a seal, tape a sling, hydrate before a drill, you're saving someone you haven't met yet. Maybe yourself. Maybe the man or woman beside you. That's what readiness is." She paused, eyes moving over the line of faces. "Strength isn't built in front of crowds. It's built when no one's watching, when it's just you, your breath, and the choice to keep going." A soft wind swept across the grinder. Fletcher folded her arms, eyes narrowed not in judgment but respect. When the recruits dismissed, Hale walked over. "That was clean," he said. "Truth usually is," she replied. As night fell, Fletcher approached her again. "You ever consider writing it down?" "What?" "What you've seen, what you've learned. People need to hear it." Mara smiled faintly. "They wouldn't believe it, and I don't need them to." Fletcher tilted her head. "You ever get tired of being misunderstood?" "Sometimes," Mara said. "But silence doesn't ask for approval, it just works." They stood there for a while, 2 soldiers from different flags bound by the same exhaustion. Then Fletcher said something unexpected. "You know, the night after Cyan, we found a crater where your convoy used to be. Nothing left but shrapnel and sand. I always wondered if anyone made it out." Mara turned toward her, the wind pulling strands of hair across her face. "Some did," she said softly. "Enough to remember, enough to regret." The next morning came gray and cold. The NATO vehicles idled by the pier, ready to depart. Fletcher approached Mara one last time. "They'll debrief you later," Fletcher said. "Probably send you to a panel. Don't let them rewrite your story." "I won't," Mara said. Fletcher extended her hand again. "You're the kind of quiet they should be training, not questioning." Mara shook it, firm and steady. "Take care of your silence too, Commander." Fletcher smiled, "Always." When they drove off, the grinder fell back into its familiar rhythm. But for Mara, Something had shifted again, not in how others saw her, but in how she saw herself. For the first time in years, she felt the edge of forgiveness, not from command, not from the ghosts of Sion, from herself. That night she wrote a report, factual, clean, dry. Nothing about memory, loss, or courage. Just line items and observations. But when she reached the last line, she hesitated, then added one sentence outside the margins. Strength remembered is strength multiplied. She read it twice, then closed the file. The lamp hummed quietly. Outside, the wind moved across the bay, soft, deliberate, alive. And as she turned off the light, she whispered the same words that had carried her through every silence since Sion. Real strength doesn't speak, it steadies. What happens when silence becomes suspicion? That was the question pressing behind every word in the command chamber as Mara Ellison stood at attention before the panel. The room wasn't large, but it felt heavy, walls layered with insignias, portraits of men long gone, air stale with the perfume of authority. 3 officers sat across from her at a narrow table. Captain Hale stood behind, uninvited but unwilling to leave. On the far end sat Commander Rhodes, his expression unreadable. And in the center, Admiral Coates, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, a man whose voice could sandblast granite. Lieutenant Commander Ellison, Coates began, tone deceptively calm. We appreciate your cooperation. This review is standard procedure. Standard procedure, the phrase that usually followed courage with doubt. Mara nodded once. Understood, sir. Rhodes opened a folder. We've received commendations and reports about your conduct during the recent field exercise. You demonstrated initiative, composure, and decisive action. Thank you, she said. However, Coates continued, certain questions remain regarding your prior service, specifically, your unrecorded role during Operation Route Sion. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was a knife waiting to drop. Mara's throat tightened. Sir, that file was sealed. Sealed doesn't mean forgotten, Coates said evenly. There are discrepancies, chain of command violations, missing debrief recordings. Some within oversight believe those omissions were deliberate. Deliberate, she repeated, quiet. Rhodes glanced at her, sympathy hidden beneath discipline. They're not accusing, they're asking. Asking, the kind of word that sounded gentle but meant interrogation. Mara clasped her hands behind her back. I acted under field necessity, not disobedience. My team leader was down. Comms were broken. Someone had to move. Without clearance, Coates said. Without time, she corrected. Coates leaned forward. You disarmed an active IED chain manually. That's suicide. It worked, she said. And 4 men died, Coates countered. Her jaw locked. 3, she said softly. Coates looked down at his notes. The report says 4. The report wasn't there, Mara replied. The air stilled. Rhodes closed the folder. Sir, he said quietly, Ellison's actions prevented total loss of convoy and intel. Command review at the time recommended citation. Which she declined, Coates said. Why? Mara's eyes flickered toward the window, the thin sliver of daylight that bled through the blinds. Because metals can't unbury anyone. The words dropped like stones. Even Hale's breathing seemed to stop. Coates sat back, expression unreadable. You think that makes you noble? No, sir, she said. It makes me responsible. A beat passed, then Rhodes spoke softly. You've carried this for a long time. I carry what's mine, she said. Coates studied her, that long, clinical kind of gaze that tried to measure the unmeasurable. And now you're training others, shaping how they see strength. Yes, sir. He leaned back. Tell me something, Lieutenant Commander. When they laugh, when they doubt, what do you think? Mara hesitated, then answered truthfully. That laughter is usually fear wearing a cheap disguise. A faint, involuntary chuckle escaped Rhodes. Even Coates allowed himself the shadow of a smile. Then his tone hardened again. One last question. If you were given field command again, would you take it? Mara's pulse slowed. In another life, that question would have been an easy yes. But now, after loss, after years of being defined by what she didn't say, it hit different. I'd take it, she said quietly, but not for redemption, for purpose. Meaning? Because I still believe lives are worth steady hands more than loud promises. For a moment, even Coates had nothing to say. Finally he nodded. That'll be all. Mara saluted, turned and left. Outside, the corridor felt colder. The polished floors reflected light in broken pieces like the past. Hale caught up to her near the exit. They won't touch your record, he said. That's not what worries me, she replied. What does? That they'll think silence means shame. Hale frowned. It doesn't. It does to people who have never needed it, she said. They walked together toward the pier. The base stretched quiet around them, recruits drilling in the distance, the clang of metal on metal, the sea whispering somewhere beyond. You handled Coates well, Hale said. I told the truth. Not all of it, he said gently. She looked at him, tired but calm. Some truths live better unsaid. That evening the bay glowed copper under a low sun. Mara sat on the edge of the dock, boots half dangling above the water. A few gulls circled overhead, crying into the wind. Her reflection stared back, older now, eyes dulled by years of duty and restraint. The scar on her arm caught the light again. She traced it absently, like reading a story written on her own skin. She thought about Route Sion, the dirt road, the dust, the smoke. The way sound turned liquid when fear mixed with adrenaline. She remembered crawling forward under the weight of the blast shield, hearing the radio scream half-sentences, feeling time stretch thin as wire. And then the moment that stayed, the sound of the firing pin disengaging, that clean, small click that meant life would go on. The silence after. The relief, the guilt, the realization that her team leader, her friend, hadn't made it. She remembered the convoy commander's face when she emerged from the smoke, the disbelief, the accusation disguised as gratitude. How the hell are you alive? He'd asked. She wanted to say because I had to be, but she hadn't. She just nodded and walked away. Now, years later, the question returned, not from Coates, not from the ghosts, but from within. Why was she still here? Because maybe survival wasn't the victory she once thought. Maybe it was the consequence. The air shifted behind her. Someone approached, light steps measured. Didn't think you'd be here, said Fletcher. Mara turned. The British liaison stood a few feet away, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. Didn't think you'd still be in the States, Mara replied. Change of plans, Fletcher said, handing her 1 cup. Command asked for a follow-up interview. I asked for permission to deliver it personally. Mara smirked. That's not regulation. Neither are half the things worth doing, Fletcher said, sitting beside her. They watched the water for a while. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was familiar. Coates gave you trouble, Fletcher said finally. I've had worse, Mara said. Fletcher sipped her coffee. They'll keep pushing. You scare them a little. Good, Mara said softly. Fear sharpens the truth. Fletcher smiled. You know, when I first heard about Route Sion, I thought it was another ghost story, the kind we tell in mess halls to remind ourselves we're mortal. But seeing you, she shook her head. It's different when the myth breathes. Mara looked down at the rippling water. Myth means I stopped being real. I'm still here. Fletcher's eyes softened. Barely maybe, but here all the same. A long pause followed. Then Mara said quietly, you ever regret surviving? Fletcher looked at her sharply. Every soldier does. The trick is learning to live without owing the dead an explanation. Mara absorbed that in silence. Then she said, almost to herself, sometimes I think the quiet isn't peace, it's punishment. Fletcher turned to her. Maybe it's both. They sat until the sun disappeared, the light fading from gold to blue to nothing. When they finally stood, Fletcher said, "You know what they'll write, right? Demonstrated exceptional control under pressure, exhibited leadership through restraint." Mara smirked faintly. "They'll make silence sound like a skill." "Maybe it is," Fletcher said. Mara looked out one last time at the bay, the shimmer of water reflecting faint stars. "Strength isn't quiet because it has to be," she said softly. "It's quiet because it doesn't need to explain itself." Fletcher smiled, a mix of respect and sadness. "That's why you scare them, Ellison. You remind them that dignity doesn't report to rank." Later that night in her quarters, Mara pulled out her old journal. The pages smelled faintly of oil and salt. She hadn't written in years, but the conversation lingered. She opened to a blank page. For a long while she just stared at it, the weight of words she'd never spoken pressing behind her ribs. Then slowly she began to write. Route Sion, 4 trucks, 16 souls, 3 returned, 1 still trying. She paused, listening to the soft hum of the lamp. The blast wasn't the hardest part. The silence after was. Another pause. People think courage shouts. It doesn't. It listens. It steadies. It remembers who's counting on it. She closed the book, the ink still wet. Outside, thunder rolled far out to sea, the kind that came without rain, just presence. And for the first time in years, Mara let herself exhale without restraint. The next morning, Captain Hale found her already on the grinder. The recruits were running laps in silence, each movement crisp, each breath controlled. He stood beside her. "They're becoming a reflection of you," he said. "Then I hope they remember to be better," she replied. He looked at her, then smiled. "They already are." For a moment the world felt still, wind, salt, noise all balanced. And in that stillness, Mara realized something simple and painful. Maybe peace wasn't the absence of conflict. Maybe it was the understanding that not every wound needs to heal for you to move forward. Sometimes strength wasn't about erasing the past. It was about carrying it quietly, without bitterness, without apology. Because the world didn't need another loud hero. It needed someone who could hold the silence without breaking. How many times can one person return to the fire before it stops being bravery? That was the question circling in Mara Ellison's head as she stood at the edge of the operations hangar 3 days later, watching the emergency lights spin red across the bay. The siren wasn't a drill this time. The tone was different, low, sustained, deliberate, real. Captain Hale jogged toward her, papers clutched in hand. "Aircraft down," he said. "Recon flight from Camp Pendleton, 2 pilots. Last contact 5 clicks off Point Loma. Coast Guard's en route, but command wants immediate eyes on scene. We're closest." "Survivors?" "Unknown. Signal dropped mid-transmission. They think 1 beacon's still active." She nodded once. "Gear status." "Ready," Hale said, "but listen." He hesitated. "What?" "You don't have to lead this, Ellison. It's open tasking. I can assign Navarro." Mara glanced toward the horizon, a thin bruise of gray forming where ocean met sky. "Navarro, a good instructor," she said, "but this isn't training." Hale exhaled. "You sure?" She adjusted her dive vest. "I'm sure." He didn't argue. He knew better by now. Minutes later she was on the deck, boat engines roaring alive. The team assembled quickly, a mix of candidates and instructors, adrenaline laced with focus. Alvarez, Parker, and 2 new faces she hadn't yet learned to read. "Simple recovery," she briefed over the wind. "Locate beacon, mark wreck, retrieve crew if possible. No heroics. We bring them home alive or accounted for." Her tone left no room for bravado. The boat launched into open water, cutting through chop and spray. The sun dipped low, bleeding color across the horizon. Mara stood at the bow, radio clipped to her vest, eyes fixed ahead. Wind stung her face, salt cutting her lips. She'd been here before, different mission, same uncertainty. The same question always followed: who was still alive? Hale's voice came through comms. Beacon signal locked, frequency 755, direction west by southwest, 1 nautical out. Copy, Mara said, adjusting course. The sea thickened with fog as they approached the coordinates. The light faded to a metallic dusk, visibility narrowing to a ghostly blur. Then a faint ping on radar, a flare bobbing weakly against the waves. Visual, Parker shouted. Bring us in slow, Mara ordered. The boat idled closer. Wreckage appeared, fragments of fuselage scattered like bones, fuel slick painting the surface in shimmering oil. And then movement. A figure clung to the tail section, barely conscious. Pilot in sight. Mara didn't wait for permission. She hit the water. The shock was immediate, cold biting into skin, muscles seizing for half a second before memory took over. She swam hard, cutting through debris, calling out, "Hold still, I've got you." The pilot's hand lifted weakly. She grabbed his harness, securing a line from her vest. "You're okay," she said, though she wasn't sure yet. Behind her, Parker threw a buoy. The others began reeling them in. When they reached the boat, Alvarez and another diver hauled the pilot aboard. He coughed seawater, trembling but alive. "One down," Parker said. "Second." Mara scanned the waves. The fog thickened again, curling like smoke. The ocean's rhythm slowed to a deceptive calm. Then another ping on her receiver, faint, further west. "Got him," she said. Before anyone could respond, she dove again. The water swallowed her in silence. Only the hiss of her regulator and the slow, deliberate thump of her heartbeat filled her world. Visibility dropped to near zero. She switched on her dive light, the beam slicing through murk. Wreckage drifted below, twisted metal, torn straps, the ghost of a cockpit. Then she saw it, a body trapped under a section of wing, air tank half tangled in mesh. She swam down, heart hammering. The pilot's mask had slipped, one glove still clinging to the harness buckle. She reached for the latch, fingers slipping on metal slicked with oil. It wouldn't budge. Her depth gauge blinked red, time running short. She braced her foot against the wreck and pulled. The buckle snapped free. She caught the pilot's vest, dragging him upward, her lungs burning as she ascended. When they broke surface, she gasped, flipping him face up. "Boat over here." The current dragged them toward the fog line. She kicked hard, every muscle screaming. A rope hit the water. She grabbed it, wrapping it once around her wrist, letting the team pull them in. When they hauled the second pilot aboard, he wasn't breathing. "CPR kit," she ordered. Alvarez dropped beside her, already moving. Mara began compressions, steady rhythm, her mind split between procedure and memory, root cyan flashing behind her eyelids. Dust replaced by water, but the feeling identical. Not again. "Come on," she whispered, "come on." 30 seconds, 40. Then a cough. The pilot's chest heaved, a spray of seawater hitting the deck. Parker exhaled so hard it sounded like a sob. "He's breathing." Mara sat back, water streaming down her face, her hands shaking harder than she wanted to admit. "Stabilize him," she said quietly. "We're heading back." No one argued. By the time they reached shore, the sky had gone black. The base flooded with lights, medics rushing the stretchers toward the infirmary. The rescued pilots disappeared behind double doors. The team stood there, dripping and wordless. Hale approached, expression unreadable, everyone intact. Mara nodded, all accounted for. He looked at her for a long moment. "You did it again." She shook her head. "We did it." But even as she said it, something inside her trembled, not from cold, but from recognition. The smell of fuel, the adrenaline crash, the helplessness before the breath returned. It all mirrored a night she'd spent years trying to forget. When she got to her quarters, she sat on the floor, back against the door, boots still wet. The quiet pressed against her like weight. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She reached for her duffel, pulling out the coin, the same one that had survived Root Cyan. The edges were smoother now, thumb-worn. The engraving almost faded. "In peace prepared," she whispered. But peace felt far away. An hour later, a soft knock broke the silence. "Mara, it's Hale." She didn't move. "Mara, open up." She stood slowly and unlatched the door. Hale stepped in, eyes scanning the room, the still-dripping gear, the untouched towel, the empty look in her eyes. "You okay?" "I'm fine." He frowned. "You're lying." "Habit," she said. He sighed. "The pilots will make it, both of them. Medics say it's a miracle." "Miracles are just delayed consequences," she murmured. Hale crouched beside her. "You pulled 2 men out of the ocean, Ellison. Don't minimize that." She met his gaze. "It's not the saving that hurts, it's the remembering." He nodded. "Root Cyan." She nodded. "It's the same heartbeat, the same seconds of not knowing if you'll make it to the surface." Hale was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "Maybe that's not punishment. Maybe that's the universe reminding you you're still needed." She laughed once, short, bitter. "Needed doesn't mean healed." "No," he said, "but it means you're still willing to go back for others. That's something." She looked down at the coin again. "You ever wonder if strength's just another word for endurance?" He smiled faintly. "Sometimes, but I think it's more than that. Endurance survives, strength saves." They sat in silence for a long time. Then Mara whispered, "It never gets easier, does it?" "No," Hale said, "but you get better at forgiving yourself for caring." By dawn, the fog had lifted. The bay shimmered gold, waves catching the first light like fire through glass. Mara walked down to the pier barefoot, boots hanging by their laces. The air was cool, almost kind. She crouched near the edge, dipping the coin into the water. Tiny ripples spread outward, vanishing fast. She whispered, "For the ones who didn't make it, and the ones who still try." Then she tucked the coin back into her pocket and stood, shoulders squared. Behind her, the base began to wake, shouts, footsteps, the metallic clank of gear. The grinder's rhythm returning. Parker approached from the side, still limping slightly from the night before. "Ma'am," he said softly, "command said the pilots asked for you." "Why?" "They said you sounded calm on the radio. They heard your voice through the static and followed it." Mara looked out at the horizon. "That's all any of us can do, follow calm through chaos." Parker nodded. "You think it ever ends, the need to prove ourselves?" She shook her head. "It ends when you stop confusing noise with strength." He smiled faintly. "You really believe that?" "I have to," she said. The wind shifted, warm now, carrying the faint scent of jet fuel and ocean salt. Mara turned toward the base, the rising sun behind her, painting her silhouette in fire and gold. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel haunted by what came next. She just felt ready. Because strength, she realized, wasn't about not breaking. It was about breaking open and still choosing to stand. What happens when silence becomes news? Mara Ellison had spent her entire career avoiding spotlights, yet now they came searching. Not because she sought them, but because the world loves stories of rescue more than stories of endurance. The morning after the mission, the base buzzed with a strange energy. Cameras on tripods, reporters in windbreakers, public affairs officers rehearsing lines they didn't believe. The rescue had gone public overnight, 2 Navy pilots saved, both alive, both already speaking to press from the hospital wing. Her name had leaked. By the time she stepped onto the grinder, recruits were whispering, not mockery this time, reverence. "Ma'am saw the footage," one said softly. "You pulled him out by hand." She didn't answer. Captain Hale was waiting for her near the bleachers. His face said everything before his words did. They want a statement. Decline it, she said. He shook his head. Command says it's non-negotiable. PR's framing this as a morale story, female officer leading successful recovery, symbol of modern readiness. Symbol, she repeated. That's another word for target. Hale's eyes softened. They're not your enemy, Mara. They're not my mission either. He sighed. Just stand there, say the basics, and get through it. She didn't argue, but her silence carried weight. By noon, the briefing area was set. Cameras, microphones, the smell of damp salt and fresh paint. Mara stood in front of the flag backdrop, still in fatigues, hair tied, expression neutral. A public affairs officer stepped to the mic. Lieutenant Commander Ellison will make a short statement regarding the recovery operation. She didn't want to be here. Every part of her screamed against it. She took a slow breath, stepped forward. 2 aviators went down off Point Loma yesterday evening, she began. They're alive because teamwork worked the way it's supposed to. No more, no less. A reporter called out, "Ma'am, we heard you dove twice without tether in low visibility. Why take that risk?" She met his gaze. Because hesitation kills faster than water. Another voice. "You've become an inspiration for women in the field. Do you see yourself that way?" She paused, then said quietly, "I see myself as a professional doing her job. The uniform doesn't care who you are, only whether you're ready." Flashbulbs popped. She gave one last sentence, "Respect the process, not the headlines." Then she stepped back. It was the shortest press briefing on record, and somehow, the one that spread the farthest. Within days, her face appeared in training newsletters, recruitment videos, even an internal memo praising quiet leadership under pressure. The story twisted itself into something digestible. They called her the silent rescuer. Mara hated it. Because silence wasn't a brand, it was survival. At the chow hall, recruits avoided eye contact now, not out of disrespect, but intimidation. Parker sat with her sometimes, trying to bridge the space. "Ma'am, they're just proud," he said one evening, pushing aside his tray. "You showed them what real strength looks like." She looked up from her coffee. "Strength doesn't need proof, Parker. It needs purpose." He nodded slowly. "You think they'll ever understand that?" "Maybe," she said, "when the noise fades." But the noise only grew louder. 3 days later, an email arrived, a request from command. Subject, speaking engagement, Women in Armed Service Symposium, Arlington. Status approved. Attendance mandatory. She stared at it for a long time before closing the laptop. That night she sat outside her quarters, the hum of the bay carrying through the dark. Fletcher had left days ago, but her words still lingered. "Don't let them rewrite your story." Now, that's exactly what they were doing. When Hale found her there, sitting with her boots untied and the coin turning between her fingers, he didn't bother pretending it was optional. "You'll represent the base," he said quietly. "I didn't ask to." Sometimes leadership doesn't ask permission. She looked up. Sometimes it should. He crouched beside her. "You can remind them what strength actually looks like. Don't let the politicians own your silence." Her eyes lifted toward the stars, faint and distant. "If I speak," she said slowly, "I'll have to tell the truth." "Then tell it," Hale said. 2 weeks later, Washington felt like another planet. The air was too dry, the uniforms too crisp, the smiles too careful. Mara stood behind the curtain of a hotel ballroom turned symposium stage. Rows of officers and civilians filled the seats beyond the glare of lights. Banners fluttered with slogans: courage, unity, progress. A moderator whispered, "You'll go last, Lieutenant Commander. Keep it under 10 minutes." She nodded, though her chest ached with unease. When her name was called, applause rippled through the room. She walked to the podium, not smiling, not waving, just walking. The microphone caught her first breath. steady and quiet. "When I joined the service," she began, "I thought strength was volume, that if you spoke loud enough, long enough, people would listen. I was wrong." The room hushed. I learned that true strength doesn't need to be seen to exist. It's not a speech or a medal or a photo op. It's the person who checks the seal on your mask before you dive. The one who tapes your sling so you don't break your wrist. The ones who never get quoted but keep everyone else alive. Somewhere in the crowd, someone nodded slowly. "I've been called quiet, cold, difficult. Maybe that's true, but I've seen what happens when noise replaces competence. People die." She paused, letting that hang in the air. "Root Sion, some of you know the name. Most don't. That's fine. What matters is that I watched brave people die because timing didn't wait for permission. I learned that courage isn't about glory. It's about clarity, doing the thing that needs doing when everyone else is frozen." A beat of silence. "If you remember anything from this," she continued, voice soft but cutting through the room, "remember this. Respect isn't something you're owed. It's something you earn in quiet moments, by listening, by learning, by showing up when it's hardest." Her gaze swept the crowd, faces rapt, lights reflecting off uniforms. "Strength looks like patience under pressure. It looks like humility after victory. It looks like silence before action." She stopped there. No dramatic ending, no applause line, just truth. When she stepped back, the audience rose, not with noise but with stillness, a standing silence. And for Mara Ellison, that was the only kind of applause that ever mattered. Afterward in the hallway, Rhodes found her by the elevators. "You realize what you just did in there? Probably ruined someone's press plan," she said. He laughed quietly. "Maybe, but you reminded a room full of officers why they joined." She smiled faintly, "Then it was worth it." He studied her for a moment. "You ever think about teaching full-time? Strategy division could use someone like you." She shook her head. "I belong where the noise starts." "Then God help the noise," Rhodes said, walking away. That night back in her hotel room, she stood by the window, the city lights stretching endless. It felt distant, a world of words and symbols that couldn't touch what she'd lived. She thought about the pilots, about Parker and Alvarez, about Fletcher, about Hale, about the ones who'd laughed and the ones who'd learned. Her phone buzzed, a message from the base. "From Parker." Message. Grinder sounds different again. "Feels steady, thought you should know." She stared at the words for a long time, then typed back. "Keep it that way, the sound matters." She set the phone down, her reflection faint in the glass. Outside, a plane rose into the dark, its lights blinking against the sky. She watched until it disappeared. And for the first time, she didn't feel haunted by recognition. She felt responsible for it. Because being remembered wasn't the goal. Being understood was. And if even one person on that grinder learned that strength could be quiet, she'd done enough. The next morning, before her flight back to California, she walked to the reflecting pool near Arlington. The air was cool still. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the coin. She turned it over once, sunlight glinting off its worn surface. For years it had been a reminder of guilt. Now it was something else, proof of return. She knelt, dipped it into the water, and whispered, "For the ones who never stopped trying." Then she stood, leaving the coin on the stone ledge. It caught the light one last time before the sun moved past it. And for the first time since Root Sion, Mara Ellison walked away without looking back. Why does peace arrive only after you've stopped expecting it? That was the thought that found Mara Ellison when her transport landed back at Coronado 2 weeks later. The California sun was waiting, hard, hot, familiar. The same light that once burned mockery into her skin now just felt warm, forgiving, even. The base looked different, though maybe it was her. The grinder gleamed under morning haze, recruits moving with a rhythm that had changed. Not perfect, but grounded. She could feel it in the air, less bravado, more purpose. As she walked across the platform, she passed a line of new candidates stretching, tapping wrists, checking gear. Young, raw, wide-eyed, the kind of faces that once doubted her. Now some of them straightened when they saw her. Not fear, respect. "Lieutenant Commander," one said, voice steady, "welcome back." She nodded, nothing more. Carry on. It was enough. Captain Hale met her near the training pool, clipboard in hand. His grin was tired but genuine. "I saw the symposium video. You realize you broke the internet, right?" "Then the internet needs better taste," she said. He laughed. Command's framing it as a recruitment win, but for once they got the message right. "Which one?" "That quiet doesn't mean weakness." Myra looked out at the water. Sunlight splintered across it, blinding and beautiful. "Took them long enough," she said softly. "Some truths are slow learners." They stood together in companionable silence, listening to the rhythmic splash of the recruits diving in. Every sound, the whistle, the shouts, the thud of boots, felt earned. Hale finally said, "I'm retiring next quarter. Command wants to name you acting head of waterborne operations." She turned to him, startled. "That's your post." "Not for long." She shook her head. "I'm not built for offices." "You're not, but this isn't an office. It's a legacy." She didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed on the water, on the ripples that spread long after the divers vanished beneath. "Let me think about it," she said finally. "Take your time," he replied. "You've earned that much." That evening the base quieted. The sunset burned orange across the bay, turning the steel hulls into silhouettes. The grinder lay mostly empty, save for Parker and a handful of recruits running extra drills, voluntary, not ordered. Mara watched from the catwalk. The air carried echoes of everything that had happened here. Laughter that had turned to silence, silence that had turned to respect. Parker saw her and jogged over, sweat streaking his temples. "Ma'am, you're back." "Briefly," she said. "How training?" "Better," he said. "Feels calmer." "Calm saves lives." He nodded. "We quote you now, you know." She frowned slightly. "Don't do that." He smiled. "Can't help it, you kind of became legend." "Legends are just stories that outlived their witnesses," she said. "Don't let me become that." He hesitated, then said, "We found your coin, the one you left in D.C. Her brow lifted. "You were in Arlington." "Training exchange. Someone recognized your name, said a coin was left by the pool, engraved with the Navy anchor and wings. I figured it was yours." "It was," she said quietly. He handed it to her, polished, still damp from the flight. The sunlight hit it just right, brightening the worn engraving. She turned it once in her palm. "Guess it wasn't done traveling." "Neither are you," Parker said. Mara smiled faintly. "You ever get tired of being right?" "Only when you start agreeing," he said. They both laughed, small, honest, short-lived. Later that night, Mara walked alone along the pier. The air was thick with salt and the scent of jet fuel drifting from the flight line. Every sound felt softer now, the kind that came when storms finally broke. She reached the end of the dock and sat, legs dangling above the water. The coin rested on her palm again, cool against her skin. For years it had been a reminder of loss, of duty, of guilt that never aged. But tonight it just felt like balance, a weight that matched her heartbeat. She thought about Route Sion, the convoy, the blast, the smoke. But instead of pain, she felt something quieter, gratitude for the ones who hadn't let her forget what survival was for. Then she thought about the ones here, Parker, Alvarez, the recruits, Fletcher, Hale, the laughter that turned into lessons. Maybe that was the point all along, not redemption, continuity. She whispered to the water, "We carry each other, even when we think we're alone." A gull called somewhere overhead. The tide pushed gently against the pilings. Mara closed her eyes and breathed. For the first time in years, the air didn't taste like regret. It just tasted like salt and sky. The next morning she showed up early before sunrise. The grinder was empty, the light pale and new. She stood where it all began, that first day when laughter had followed her like a shadow. Now there was only wind. She could almost see the ghosts of that morning, Navarro's smirk, the uncertain stares, the whispered doubts. And then, layered over them, the echoes of what came later, the dive, the rescue, the respect. The silence here had changed. It no longer accused, it remembered. As the first recruits trickled in, stretching and jogging into position, she called out, "Before we start, one thing." They froze, turning toward her. "Strength," she said, "isn't the loudest person in the room. It's the one who keeps going after the noise stops." A few nodded. Every seal, every strap, every motion, it matters. You don't earn respect by talking. You earn it by consistency, by presence. She paused. "And if you forget everything else, remember this: courage isn't fire, it's maintenance." The recruits didn't cheer, they didn't clap, they just stood a little taller. That was enough. As the day stretched on, she trained beside them, not above them. Same drills, same sweat, same silence. At one point during a break, Alvarez walked past and murmured, "You know, ma'am, it's strange. When you first came here, this place felt loud. Now it feels calm." Mara wiped sweat from her brow. "Calm's contagious." He nodded, "So's respect." She didn't answer, she didn't have to. That evening, Captain Hale found her near the hangar, writing something on a clipboard. "Still thinking about that offer?" he asked. "I was," she said. "Now I'm accepting it." He smiled. "You'll do fine." "I'll do quiet," she said. "That's better," he replied. She handed him the clipboard. "One condition." "Name it." "No ceremonies, no speeches, just the work." Hale laughed. "Of course you'd ruin a good photo op." "Tradition," she said dryly. They stood together, watching the sun fall behind the horizon, that same endless line she'd chased her whole life. "You ever regret not saying more?" he asked finally. She thought about it, then shook her head. "Words fade, the work stays." He nodded slowly. "Then I guess that's your legacy." When night came, she stayed behind, long after the others had gone. The base lights flickered against the water, painting trails of gold across the bay. She sat on the same steps she had years ago, boots laced, uniform folded with care. The air carried the hum of distant engines, the faint laughter of the night crew, the metallic clink of rigging against masts. She thought about the beginning, the laughter that met her, the resistance, the doubt, and how none of it mattered now. Because the grinder didn't sound the same anymore. It sounded earned. She smiled to herself, small in content. Strength, she thought, doesn't shout. It checks the straps early. It listens for leaks. It respects before demanding it. And then softly the words came, not as confession but as truth. "Sometimes," she whispered to the quiet, "dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts." The wind carried the words out over the bay, where they vanished into salt and night. And as the lights dimmed across Coronado, Mara Ellison stood, shoulders squared, gaze steady, not as a legend, not as a story, but as proof. Proof that real strength leaves no echo. It leaves a standard.